I believe that people are inherently good. People want to do things for the betterment of all of us, but we have to bring them in. And if it feels too disconnected, if it feels like you're looking up at, somebody getting an Oscar and it's just that moment and they're saying, do this, it's very easy to see how there's no real connection there. Globally, humans are kind. We want to help each other. When there's moments of catastrophe around the world, we pretty much all get involved. And I think sometimes we can forget that. And I think news perhaps forgets that. So,
welcome back to Plant Fueled. What does it take to hold on to the climate conversation when the world is no longer watching? This week, I sit down with Josh Wheeler, founder of B Broadcast and the mind behind Mission Control, The Climate Conversation, a groundbreaking report that pulls back the curtain on how UK media actually talks about climate change, or more often doesn't. Over 6 months, his team analysed 45,000 broadcast segments across national TV and radio. What they found? Coverage is fleeting, reactive, and driven almost entirely by disaster. A wildfire, a summit, a scandal, and then silence. Meanwhile, one night at the Oscars gets nearly 2/3 of the attention the climate crisis receives in half a year. But this episode is not just about media. It's about momentum, about how movements evolve when nobody is clapping, about the psychology of urgency, the burden of hope, and what it takes to keep driving conversation when the cameras stop rolling. We explore how media trust is shaped by media framing, the role of friction on societal change, and why the stories we don't tell might be just as powerful as the ones we do. From regional community radio to global broadcasters, from eco-anxiety to everyday engagement. This conversation is really a deep dive in what it means to keep the most important issues on the table. And Josh, a storyteller rooted in data, gives us the blueprint. So if you've ever felt disillusioned, overwhelmed, or unsure on how to keep talking about climate change in a way that moves the needle, this episode is for you. I'm your host, Callum Weir, and this is the Plant Fuel Podcast. If I could ask just one thing, and the only thing I will ever ask, is this. If these conversations are resonating with you, drop a follow, leave a quick star rating, subscribe or share it with somebody that cares. Whatever the platform you listen on allows you to do. It helps us grow, brings you the guests and the conversations you've been asking for, and most of all keeps these deeper conversations going. It's a small gesture that goes a long way. But now to Josh Wheeler, let's dive in. Peace and plants. Josh, welcome.
thanks so much, mate. Good to be here and good to talk to you about this.
The climate crisis. We're just gonna jump in straight away.
Go big.
Yeah. It's getting worse and worse, yet less and less attention on a day-to-day basis. I think myself, with the work that I'm in, I'm definitely in a bubble, more of an echo chamber maybe, where I think from my side, I thought the narrative is being pushed left, right, and center. And then obviously got my hands on your report. And let's face it, I think that very much blew my mind. And I had to kind of step back from where I was at, take myself out of that bubble, take myself out of that echo chamber that I was in, and realize that maybe it's being under-talked about, underappreciated, under-publicized, and the coverage that there isn't what I assumed it was. It's not as much as I assumed it was.
I think, firstly, sorry. Secondly, because I do say sorry because there are people doing amazing things in this space, right? In every space, and it's so easy. I'm going to be in echo chambers that I don't even realize about, and it's so easy to kind of be in that area. I think, and I also think there's comfort in that. I'm not one of these people that thinks that that's necessarily just a bad thing. We don't need to be presented with the opposite side and horror 24/7. We don't always need that. And actually, there is a bit of, collective positivity. Seeing people doing things and talking about the key issue is key. But I think what our report has uncovered, we took the last 6 months of mentions of climate change. So to begin with, we look at, what kind of phrases, terms, things do we use around this within the media, and specifically looking at TV and radio on this to kind of really draw out like what's the strategy in quote unquote terms. We do this kind of activity for clients based on what they're doing, but we are able to see from, I think it's about 45,000 hits over that 6-month period, a pattern that emerged straight away, that it was driven entirely on a reactive basis. So during this period, we had the floods in Spain, we had the LA wildfires, we had the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, and it's like a roller coaster. It's up and then down, up and then down. There is very little ongoing discussion about the issue, the challenges, or even, and this is probably hopeful in saying it in its entirety, but actually the hope of what we could do in the future. It's just, here's a big scary moment, shock and awe, and then we move on to the next thing. And that is part and parcel. It's the news industry, but this is a unique example. One of the things that we did was to look at other comparable subjects, so things that directly impact us, but are also a bit tangential. So things like the economy. People aren't necessarily walking around being impacted by the economy every day, but we think about it, right? We know it's having an effect on it. Significantly higher. We looked at things like public health, significantly higher. 45,000 sounds like a lot, but actually it's pretty small fry for a 6-month period of something of its magnitude. So yeah, it's an area that we're not doing enough on.
Yeah, I think when you realistically look into it, however long a 6-month period is, and then the amount of news and radio and TV broadcast studios there are, it really narrows down to not that much, relatively very little. And is that because the UK is such a smaller population though, or is that because if you look into somewhere like the States, which has a larger population, a larger percentile of people, bigger news networks, and it's then trying to find out if it looks significantly smaller because we are a lower population country?
I'd like to say that that's the reason. It's not. It's the UK is actually, and certainly in the broadcast landscape, it has significant opportunity. There are a lot of stations that can be covering this. From a regional perspective, even from a national perspective, we have a lot of news output. I think the issue comes in. There's a lot of different factors as to why it's not making its way through, apart from these moments. But ultimately, if we think about the other factors, the other stories that are taking that space, the topicality of them, other things are making their way through in a regular, almost drumbeat momentum. And that should be the case. We should be thinking about all of these things. It's not to say that we shouldn't be talking about the economy, or we shouldn't be talking about mental health or well-being or community or any of these things. But with climate, the only point that it comes through is during these shock moments. Outside of that, there's nothing at all.
Yeah, for someone that doesn't really watch the news myself, the only time I ever kind of see these, big escalations of climate is through your Instagram, is through your, LinkedIn. And normally it's when something huge has happened. So when obviously we look at the most recent, which is like the LA wildfires, it's very much that blew up all over social media because it was being talked about everywhere. But as soon as, that 2-week period had kind of died off, no one really cared anymore. It wasn't on social media again. Obviously, there's people that it has affected, so they're kind of regaining their lives, and people are following them and supporting them as much as they can. Yeah. But that's through on an individual level, or people on places like Instagram. Whereas news networks, for instance, after that 2 weeks is over, it's kind of like, hey, that's done. We're shelved. Maybe we might speak about it in a few months' time, just kind of like the repairs and see what's happening. But realistically, it doesn't really get the airtime that should do for such a large population of people that have literally lost their homes, lost their livelihoods, lost their businesses, lost lives. It's such a 2-week period is realistically, for people probably don't want to be talking about it because it is that kind of eco anxiety that people do have about that. But at the same time, we kind of wash it off these days like it's nothing, like it's just another movie clip. It's just, we forget about it.
Maybe, maybe there's an element of the fact that we're becoming so used to it that to an extent we're becoming desensitized to it. And I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an interesting interplay of what's driving what. Is it that we're seeing things potentially on TV, hearing them on radio, reading about them in the papers that then sparks it across Instagram and social media? Is it the other way round? It could be a bit of both. And I think that I'm a believer in cross media. So activity, it should be across everything. So if you're thinking about reaching something, a goal of whatever, it should include all of those different facets. Very often there'll just be a focus on one thing and then that's it. I also think one of the things that we found was around the emotion and the charge within a lot of the coverage that is out there. So I think it's something like 85% of the coverage that we see is heavily emotionally charged. And you talked about eco anxiety and the nervousness and the panic of it. I think also if you lay that on top of everything else that's going on in the world, war, pandemics, all of these things, we're living in a time where it's just, I think they term it omni-crisis, where every day you wake up and your phone, if you have the news apps, you wake up to something else has happened. And you said a moment ago about, not engaging with the news. And I hear that more and more. And I think I get it. I totally get it. And I empathize with it. It concerns me a bit in the sense of, I think it's important that we do have that touch point. We do kind of keep in line with it, but I totally understand it because actually seeing it and as someone who works in news, lives and breathes it, there are days where I'm like, oh, you feel like you've been punched in the stomach. But I think it's part and parcel of the emotional charge of this. So these things are driven, we've found things like the phrase like ticking time bomb is huge in there. And actually, when you start to play that out in people's minds, if they're already at 90%, and then suddenly there's something else, you're pushing people to the edge consistently. And I think that maybe that is something that as a creative industry, we can be thinking about. People respond to stories. The reason this platform works so well is we're able to sit and talk about it. We're able to talk about the impact of what you do on somebody else and vice versa. When it comes to kind of TV news, radio news, it's like pow, pow, pow. There's something consistently, you're always in crisis. And I think is to an extent is putting people off. I think that people aren't necessarily feeling that there's an element of hope within these stories. And I know that it probably feels at ends to talk about climate change and hope, because actually what we do here constantly is that charge of emotion. But if we can make and reorganize this theme and this topic into something that impacts me in where I live in Manchester, and we're not necessarily, or I don't think we're necessarily seeing the direct impacts of climate change. That doesn't mean to say I don't know about them. And it doesn't mean to say that I don't care about them. And that's the same across the country. Brits are notoriously a kind bunch. And I think not just Brits, but I think globally humans are kind. We want to help each other. When there's moments of catastrophe around the world, we pretty much all get involved. And I think sometimes we can forget that. And I think news perhaps forgets that. So I think maybe we need to be looking at how do we make this about people? How do we try to, yes, we know we need to know the scary, but actually, how do we make it hopeful? Or how do we try to weave in emotion that brings us into it a bit more, rather than just kind of making us go, I can't cope with this,
I think you hit the nail on the head, because the one reason that I kind of stopped watching was because you'd wake up, you turn on the news, and it's just bad, 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 bad. It doesn't give you kind of any tangible solution to what we can do. You may get a few people giving, like 2 minutes of without Piers Morgan, for instance, shouting over them. There's never a tangible solution. There's never what can we do. It's all about this is happening, and that's literally it. There's not this is happening. Maybe you could help in this way, or giving some solution. But it's literally we're just telling you the news as it is. It's depressing, and it's going to be depressing every day for the next however long. Whereas if it was changed and turned around, being like, hey, this is happening in the world, this is a solution. We may not have the right solution at this moment, but this is how you can help. This is how it's impacting other people. Because I feel like they don't talk about how it's impacting people. They're talking about how it's impacting a population instead of, individuals. And I think on an individual level, that's when we start to care the most, when we realize there's a person behind this, instead of, let's say, a million people. Because a million people, we're kind of like, it's fine. But if you then
feels
spoke about
too far away.
Yeah.
Feels too far away. Yeah.
Whereas if someone was like, there was small segments on people that is affected, people would, I think, progressively care more about these solutions. But because they don't have those solutions in front of them, they don't have those people, it's just seen as a percentile of a population. They're kind of like, much like the California fires. Like, unless you know somebody on Instagram or like Facebook that's reposting these things, the media doesn't show like the individual. It's just kind of like, hey, California's on fire. And California, to a lot of people, is just the whole of America, basically.
Yeah.
So you're kind of like, why should I care? It's not my country.
And also, I think as well, I don't want to make assumptions, but certainly around that, there was a lot of sentiment around parts of California being incredibly wealthy. And I remember reading, especially on social media, I remember reading of people trying to get across the point that actually a lot of the areas that were being impacted were areas of economic deprivation. But in the mindset, it was, well, it's wealthy, so we don't need to do anything. And that, I think, is an interesting one, because it's these generalizations that we really quickly make about situations, and it's the connecting me into the story. That's the really big thing. I think for the longest time, when it comes to climate, and certainly within this, it points to the focus being on the losses, right? This isn't working, XYZ, we're not going to meet this target, we're not going to, yada yada. Why should we do this when actually nation states are not doing anything, or they're not? And suddenly, as an individual, you start to think, well, why am I worried about this? What can I do? And that feeling of hopelessness, it feels like it feels empty. And then you hit people with, here's another example of something happening, and you start to then go, well, what can I do in this situation? There's nothing I can do. So actually, why are you presenting it to me? And then you're in this battleground. And I think that what we probably need to look at is how we genuinely empower people and groups of people. So, audiences of a specific area, how do you actually do that, as opposed to just overwhelming them with scary, right? And I think maybe part of it is news is really important. We shouldn't hide away from the bad. We shouldn't kind of be put off just by the shock factor. But what needs to happen is the next bit. So maybe there is a call here in, some of the things that we as a society and as a species, we've moved the dial on things when it's been in popular culture. been in entertainment, it's been in soap, it's been in all of these different areas, and make it kind of, it's part of the backdrop. It's part of the environment of what's happening in there. It's not just the headline and the thing that's going to scare you. So I think if you can do things like that, you can start to help people to feel that their actions actually matter. You know, deciding which bin the bottle goes in. Right, we can probably all agree it's a bit of a pain, but most people go, do you know what? I'm doing my bit in that instance. And then when you start to rationalize that and show them that does have an impact, then they'll want to probably do more. And I think that's important. I think that change is actually possible. You think about, you know, over the last 50 years, the social norms, the laws that have changed around things, they've often gone hand in hand with how things have been represented in things like EastEnders or Coronation Street. You think about how EastEnders or Coronation Street have tackled things like mental health. And they've done it so well and so effectively. And now we've got different types of entertainment. So we also have social media. We have influencers. All of these things are really, in my mind, the same. It's a different version of the same thing. And actually, how can we be working with those things better and doing things more? I've never seen, or I can't think, you know, an episode of Coronation Street where they've talked about climate change, or where they've demonstrated it, or reality TV, which we know is so popular, but I don't think it necessarily talks to it. I did see one thing that I thought was very effective. I think it was the sponsor of Love Island. They did something where, I might be wrong here, but they did something where they announced that actually all of the clothes that the contestants were wearing on Love Island were pre-loved. So they were secondhand. Amazing. And the subtlety of that is telling that audience that there's a reason for this. This matters. But actually, maybe we should have, I don't watch Love Island, but maybe we should have Love Island in the future. You know, it's in a pretty nice location at the moment. Maybe we put Love Island in an area where it's facing the direct impacts of climate change. I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of whether anything like that would be possible. But actually, it would, in a way, it would encourage the contestants to talk about it. It would encourage the viewers to then go, oh, that I'm part of this, because you feel like you're connected to those people, and that, I think that is really powerful. And it's not just a case of you need to do this and you need to do that. I think that's the missing link. I think we're not quite there yet. And then it encourages people to go, what I'm doing or what I could do is important.
I actually really like that idea. However, I love the fact that potentially could work. However, I think going in back to the kind of eco anxiety, people watch these things to switch off. People want to have something mind numbing, so they don't have to think about, you know, their work day, their, you know, the anxieties of life, their financial issues and things like that, without having, you know, to sit at home 7 o'clock at night with your dinner and then worry about climate change with a load of half naked people. Once again, it would make climate change sexy. However,
it might depends on who's in. But I think the bit is genuinely, it's almost like it's got to be, it's part of it as opposed to it being it. So I'm talking here about, you know, we very often get hung up on the headline of something. And I think that's the bit, you know, Coronation Street as an example, they will do mental health really, really well, right? There was the chap from X Factor, I think, died by suicide, and they did it so well. I think they even got a BAFTA for one of the episodes because it was so powerful and so useful. And they teamed up and they worked with charities and experts on these things. Like, they take it really seriously, as they should. What I'm saying is, at the same time with Coronation Street, you'll have that storyline developing, and you'll also have I haven't watched Corrie for a while, but you'll also have a story where, you know, there's something going on in the cabin. And I think that balance of light and shade is really important. I think that's what what will bring us along the journey. Like lots of people have watched and you no doubt will have seen kind of Just Stop Oil and the activity that they've taken. And I think Just Stop Oil have been a real force for good in the sense of bringing it into our mindsets. I think where it's perhaps hit the buffers a bit is that it's been that light and shade moment. It's all been shade. It's all been direct action, or what has reached the majority of people. And then people have gone, well, that's an inconvenience, that's impacting me, and and you need to bring people along with us. And suddenly that's the narrative, and it's the thing itself. The activity has become the story as opposed to the issue. And I think it was very much of its time. But if you think back to the things like the animal rights movement and animal testing, you absolutely had direct action that had its absolute place and did an awful lot of good. You also had, I say it's very of its time, but you also had celebrities either with makeup or like outfits, almost like dressed up as some of the endangered species, and a bit weird. But at the same time, it allowed people to, at the time go through the papers and be like, oh my God, and then read about what it is. And suddenly, over time, that then starts to go into our mindsets, and we all kind of broadly go, I don't need fur. I don't need, and actually, I think that's where we haven't quite got to yet. So I'm kind of, Just Stop Oil have announced, obviously, they're moving away from direct action, but I hope that doesn't mean they're moving away from activity. I think that's the bit, and I hope that the balance is there in the coming months.
Yeah, I do hope that activity still happens, but that direct action, I think, for better or for worse, it's had its publicity mostly for the worst, because they glued themselves to the middle of the road, which I understand why they do it. However, it has come at a inconvenience to some people's lives, for instance, and things like ambulances, but I absolutely get why they do it, and I fully support.
There is no progress without inconvenience.
Yeah, if you look at for instance, you go back to the suffragettes, for instance, a long time ago. If they didn't do what they were doing, there wouldn't be women's rights at this point. And I think there has to be an inconvenience. There has to be some detrimental effects for things to actually change. As much as these things can be bad for society at that time, or to a few people's lives at that time, or it's an inconvenience that you've missed work. Also, at the same time, when people moan that they've missed work, I'm like, why? Why? Why are we caring this much about that you missed a day? It's not an issue. But without those things happening, action doesn't get taken. And yes, Just Stop Oil, they've created a lot of havoc. They've been throwing things on the Mona Lisa or whatever, and yeah, it looks bad. But over the long term, it's probably going to help.
Yeah. That's the bit. The bit is we have tapped into what they have done so effectively is tap into consciousness, right? As difficult as it is, when the TV and social media show the Mona Lisa situation, it forces us to think about it. Now, the big question around what they do, and I think this is where it's lost its footing, and I think they've realized this, is that has the conversation around that, has it changed from thinking about climate change and the impact to, has it changed to thinking about Just Stop Oil are a bad organization and they shouldn't do X, Y, and Z? And I think that has where it's got to, the difficulty, the inconvenience overall. And that's where I was, that light and shade. I think people would have been more forgiving of that activity if it also came with the light and shade. So I'm not saying that it shouldn't have happened. You can't have progress without inconvenience. You have to get attention on things. And this data proves that the attention is not there, right? So you have to do something. You'll have to agitate to catch that attention. But I think also it probably needed to be mirrored with light and shade. And I think they've learned that. I hope they've learned that, because they talk about in their announcement they've reached certain markers. I think they were saying that they've reached a couple of kind of points where actually direct action isn't necessarily needed anymore, and what they're going to do is X, Y, and Z. It could also be that actually they're struggling a bit with, media perception and things like that, which is fine. All of that can be worked on, and I think that's what will come next.
For those listening, I will link the show notes below for the report, so people can actually have some kind of in-depth visuals and in-depth knowledge of what we're actually talking about. But for this report, it's pretty in-depth. It's knowledgeable. However, what urges someone to jump straight in and create this? Like, it's a big task to undertake and decipher and lift the lid on, all of what UK broadcasters are covering and what they aren't covering. Like, not many people want to undertake that task because it's huge.
Yeah. Thank you, firstly. And I should say, I think we were talking. I and we are not experts in climate or sustainability. We work with some fantastic people that absolutely are, and we would always point in that direction. What we are good at is understanding the media, and the way that we do that is through things like this. So our clients work with us and trust us to be able to guide them on perception of themselves, topics, areas that they're in, to be able to impact change. We aren't in the business. I know that PR perhaps has an odd reputation in some circles, and it's odd because we're in the business of reputation, but we're not in the business of pushing negative narratives. Very often clients are looking to do positive work genuinely, and so for us, something like this is allowing us to be able to say to clients, right, we've done this in the world of mental health, we've done this in the world of well-being, we've done this in the world of here. Have we looked at this? Have we thought about what we're doing? There are lots of clients that will have sustainability goals, objectives, and activity. And for us, it's about making sure that we fully understand this issue in the same way that we understand what's going on with the economy, etc., etc. So it really is something that we're doing pretty much across all subjects, but actually we're drawing this one out in particular to talk to people like yourselves who are experts in this field that that we are not, to be able to say, hey, like, what's the gap? How do we reach for people who are listening that can then almost kind of take this on and run with it, and and actually do something with it in the same way that we will be with clients. So the hope is that genuinely something like this, there's good, and we've also been sharing it with media to say, this is something. And I think going back to the actions and the importance of what we're doing and what clients do in this space and what brands do, is I think it is a difficult, challenging area for a business to step into, but so was mental health. And I think if you track back over the last 10, 15 years, maybe 20 years, the way that we talked about mental health was very different to the way that we do it now. And I have done lots and lots of pieces of activity in the world of mental health for lots and lots of brands. It's doable. It takes bravery and it takes guts to be able to do it. And it does take a lot for an organization to step in there, but it can be done. The mental health is perfect, is a perfect embodiment of the fact that it can be done. Just takes that step. And maybe it's things like this that give people that confidence to say, well, actually, we could step into that space. It's a bit of a grey area at the moment because our media covering it in the way that we would need to and all of that. But the proof is in the pudding. It's doable. And I would hope that listeners are able to look at this and go, okay, we can also do X, Y, and Z.
Yeah, I think, as you just mentioned, it's very much every movement is at one point going to have friction to begin with. whether that be the mental health crisis. Because at first, I'm assuming when we first started talking about this, nobody really cared and nobody really believed it existed. And now we
Absolutely.
very much, we have rights around it. We have, we have a lot of publicity around it and direct action to help people. The same with any other movement, whether that be the LGBTQ plus community as well. At first that was seen as bad, and now it's very much out in the public eye. There's riots depending what country you're in, and but those things are moving and progressive, and as we touched on earlier, the suffragettes movement, people wouldn't have those rights now if it wasn't for that friction that there was at first. But
And
when we,
if you touch on that point again, like LGBT, women's rights, all of those things. I was about to say women's rights and the suffrage movement at the time. I'm not sure in terms of where it was at the time when it came to entertainment and stuff. But if you take like LGBT rights, actually that's mirrored in society. It's mirrored in light entertainment. It's another example of this stuff is doable. You just have to reach people. You have to reach people and bring them into it and give them experience of a world that perhaps seems scary, seems intimidating or daunting. But once you bring them in, they're pretty much with you. Save for blips in the world, but they're pretty much with you. I think inherently people are good, but I think also as a species we're nervous and we're scared of everything. So if something's new and it's challenging, our de facto is to kind of hide away from it, block it out. And actually, that's where we go wrong.
And I think that's the same with every different aspect. Something new, we always have some kind of wall against it. For instance, back in the day, people were being hey, nothing's going to take over the radio when TVs came along. They didn't think it was going to be a thing, and obviously it's a very different situational aspect. Yeah. But people were scared, and now TV is the norm. Whereas, so we always have something to get our back up against until it becomes the normality of the world. Because at first we're TVs, no, radio is the thing. But now TVs, when something new comes along, people are going to be that's not going to take off. And then it does. And that's the same with every different aspect, whether that be movements, whether that be technology, whether that be, there's always that scare factor of being this is new. How is it going to,
how are we going to cope with it?
Yeah.
We talked about soap, and I keep coming back to soap in a sense, but I think it's a good driver of activity. It needs to, it will evolve and cross over. But I read that EastEnders are actually tackling a story at the moment of one of the youth characters using AI as his friend. And I think there's various different, I haven't watched EastEnders in a while, but I read it, but essentially he's using a chat bot as his confidant and his friend because he's lonely and doesn't have friends. The fear from, I think the inference from the article was that his parents are worried and scared, and of course there's protection and all of that stuff that's kind of going on there. But it's kind of it's the perfect example of right now we're looking at AI and how that's impacting and is going to impact us as a society, and EastEnders is there already. But if you think back, what you said, people used to think that, if you watched Elvis shake his hips, you'd go to hell or something. It's so human for us to be worried about these things. And actually, I think the best way in lots of it is to talk about it, is to shine a light on it, talk about it, and then you can do things. But perfect example of EastEnders tackling AI and our concerns about it in a way that is directly human. Because do you know what? I bet you that there are many, many young people, in the same way that when I grew up with MSN Messenger, it was just the norm of how I would talk. My parents would be like, "You've seen your friends at school all day. What do you need to talk to them for?" I'm like, "You don't get it."
I remember those days.
And there's always going to be something with those kind of innovations. I bet you there are many young people that use their chatbots as a confidant, as a diary. Is that bad? Is that good? I don't know. we'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, I think
But
that's one of those things that it's later on down the line we see how that's affected us, whether that be for good and for bad. And I think it's going to be a bit of both. I think
yeah,
there's going to be, yes, it's probably going to help society improve and evolve, but at the same time, there's people that have been using it as like a partner, or was that lonely or whatever, and like they've kind of commandeered that as a friend.
yeah,
And does that have negative impacts? Probably. But at the same time, at that moment in time, they didn't really have anything else. So if
yeah,
that thing was there to help them improve, then go for it. Like,
yeah.
yes, there's going to be some negative, but there's negative impacts with everything.
Everything.
Like
Yeah,
you look at like the gaming industry, you look at the TV industry, you look at any industry, there's negative impacts to things. It's addiction.
yeah.
And
But you take gaming as you flip gaming. Just last week we had I think it was the first gaming BAFTAs.
mm,
Amazing, amazing, because the amount of work that goes into that content, and the amount of not the amount of the role that plays in people's lives, everyday people. It's not just that perception of a gamer of what we perhaps had in the 90s, where they were like grotty young men playing Tomb Raider. I think it's evolved hugely. It's a multi-billion industry now. That's not just grotty teenagers in their bedroom anymore. It's so much bigger. And actually, things like that getting the recognition that they deserve is another step. We are constantly evolving, and we've done that through popular culture, news, impact. All of these things have combined. And actually, if we throw it back onto climate change, you can kind of see gaming versus climate change.
mm.
And suddenly you're like, actually, these two things are not equal. And why? And that's what we need to work on.
When you did this report and you got and you analyzed everything, and obviously this is from obviously different broadcast segments. Was this just? I'm guessing this is just radio and TV more than it was, podcasts and other
That's right.
maybe articles. But were you surprised with the results? Like, is this what you expected to come out of it?
It's not. If I'm brutally honest, it's not. Which is I probably shouldn't admit it as someone that professes to be an expert in broadcast, but it wasn't. 45,000 sounds a lot, but in comparison to other issues of a similar magnitude, it's small fry. It's tiny. And we started looking at the kind of, the bigger societal issues, economy, etc., public health, completely eclipsed. And then we started to think, well, if this isn't getting the focus, what is taking space in this area? And so we started looking at what else was happening during that 6-month period. And one of the things that happened was the Oscars. Now, the Oscars, I'm not taking away from the Oscars at all. We need a bit of glitz and glam in our life. People, it's a big moment for people. And people love to talk about the clothes, the speeches, everything. However, I think the Oscars, which is really, in my mind, is a one-night event. There's going to be a bit of fallout. Did the right person win? But, I'd argue that the majority of us probably can't really remember who won what. Maybe the, best film. But actually that secured, I think, 65% of the same amount that climate change got.
I've got the statistic here as well, which I think 29,630 times.
Yeah. And that I think is when you put those two things together, you start to realize, just how little is being put into. So you're comparing 6 months of an issue where you've actually had the wildfires, you've actually had the floods, you've had the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, you've had various different things happening globally that haven't necessarily made their way through to the UK or the kind of the global agenda for various reasons. But yet the Oscars, guess what? Over half.
And surely, that only gets really spoken about maybe 2 or 3 weeks leading up to the Oscars, because that's not really spoken about 6 months prior. That's very much maybe 2 to 3 weeks at best. And that's one award show as well. that shouldn't have so much of an impact. It's really kind of like a no-brainer because it doesn't really contribute anything apart from kind of stroking egos for a lot of people.
Absolutely, and there is. Do you know what though? I agree. There is also absolutely place for it, right? There is place for light and shade, light and shade. We want to see, as a society, I think there is a place in it. Otherwise, it wouldn't exist. We want to see, the beautiful. We want that. We need that, right? We need to see, people's work being recognized. We talk about entertainment and how important it is. If you think back to COVID, TV and film, it kept us going. It kept us going. And actually, there is that place. However, I think it's not, the thing I would stress is it's not to take away from the Oscars. It's not to take away from any of that. But actually, when you put that, and as you say, 2-week period, there's going to be some buzz, specific presenters are going to want to talk about Wicked as a movie, and, it's going to win on the Oscars. But really, if you think about broad, massive discussion, it's going to be that 2-week period. If even that, I'd argue it's even 2 days, to be honest. And when you think about that in comparison to climate change, you suddenly realize that the Oscars is important, but whoa, we are not talking about this enough. That's the point.
We do see once in a while as well, when it does come to the Oscars or like any of these kind of award shows, that there are some celebrities that will get on stage, and instead of thanking people, they will kind of push, whether that be like climate change or rights for whatever, fill in blank. Some people will talk about those things, and then that does have a direct impact, because then that becomes the news for like weeks and weeks after. It's just having those people kind of stand up and talk about it, and like, it's not every single one is going to be doing that, because we had like, I think Leonardo DiCaprio years ago talking about climate change at one point. However, since then, I don't know how much has really been spoken about from him. I know he does a lot of work in the industry, but obviously when that was spoken about, that kind of had like an impact for months and months after, maybe up to a year. Then I think there was a documentary that got made surrounding it. Then it kind of died off until somebody else with such a big following kind of like comes along and then does something again like that. I know Joaquin Phoenix is another one that does that. Until those actually happen, then like you can use that kind of cause for a momentum of change as well.
I massively, the power of celebrity within this is vital. Now the difficulty is, and I think the difficulty in 2025 and beyond, and this is only going to intensify, is that how much are we going to accept celebrities telling us what to do? And I think climate is a good example of this, because there are so many sources of information, and I use the word information rather than fact. There's so many sources of information and opinion that make this a really difficult area for us to be able to navigate. There are different types of podcasts, there are different types of media that will lean a certain way, and so actually for us it's very tough to ultimately find the truth on this. And celebrities have, I think, paid a bit of a price in terms of, standing up for a cause, and I think that is going to be something that continues. That the comments on things will go a certain way. If you think about, the prime example of, say, Harry and Meghan, who have invariably championed this as a cause, but then been criticised for things like private jet usage. And it's a tough one, because at the same time, do you need a private jet? Does that make sense? Because you need to logistically get from A to B, and you could sit and logistically argue for everything, but ultimately it's A versus B, and suddenly B becomes really important. So it's where does this become part of the story as opposed to the story? And I think that's the differentiator. I think if you talked about DiCaprio, perfect example. I think that when that happened, it was at a perfect time where people were more open and more willing to kind of engage with stuff like that, and things have changed. But DiCaprio went on to, I'm not sure if he created it, but he certainly starred in it on that, I think it was Netflix, the Don't Look Up series.
Yeah.
Series film. And, you know, had mega stars in there. Meryl Streep, who was amazing in it. Meryl Streep playing the kind of the president that wasn't really prepared to listen. You had the biggest pop star in the planet, Ariana Grande, that then went on to release a song, I believe, that was it. You know, everything that you could possibly imagine. And it cut through. And that was about an asteroid coming. But it was a metaphor of climate change. You know, when we're not looking, we're not listening, we're not paying attention. And I think that did so much good, because in a weird way, it was about climate change without even saying it. You know, and I think that is actually what I would almost kind of point to as a bit of a blueprint. You know, that's where we've got to get to. We've got to frame it in a way that it's part of. You know, it's part of the thing. You know, maybe genuinely, you know, as a very basic example, maybe we need people in EastEnders and Coronation Street to go on holiday and to face flash flooding. That could be so powerful, but it hasn't been done, and I wonder why. I mean, obviously, it's location and all that stuff, but but it's that you know, that breakdown of barriers. And that's where I think the DiCaprio thing is a perfect example. And he has been, you know, there's challenges with DiCaprio, but he has been vociferous on it. And that film was fantastic and superb at getting the message across.
I think when it does come to celebrities and cultures, as you said, you know, some people aren't just going to accept like what they're saying. And is this now because we're putting, you know, unrelatable humans on a pedestal where people are kind of like, hey, it's okay for them because they've got money, they can do this, they can, you know, do what they want, they can, you know, they've got the resources to do these things, whereas, you know, an everyday person, you know, let's say working in a supermarket, it's kind of like, how do I actually change this? There's no tangible solution. I don't have the resources to go out and do these things. And I think they're then looking at somebody that's winning an Oscar as like an unrelatable human, because these people are, for good or for worse, being put on pedestals. And obviously we like the glitz, we like the glamour, and that's great. But like, then there's the realization that these people can say what they want about like whatever change they want. But for the average everyday person, going through and doing anything to do with that is going to be so much harder, as much as, or they think it's going to be so much harder because it's an unrelatable situation for them. Whereas realistically, we're all the same person. It's not to do with resources. It's just about being more open-minded towards things. But because they're seen as, you know, so far away from us and so far removed, that we then just feel like it's not a relatable cause that we can champion on.
I think that is the big problem that we face. It's the big challenge that we face when it comes to this subject. But also, it's the big challenge we face. What I like to do is chuck a bit of hope in there. It's the big challenge that we face across pretty much every subject. But you know, it's pretty pronounced in climate. I would give the example. We did some work with an epilepsy charity in the UK. Now, epilepsy affects a proportion of people, not a huge proportion in terms of the entire populace, but the charity was looking at highlighting the lives of people living with epilepsy, the difficulties, the challenges, what happens to them. It's tough, and there's a stigma, and there's all of those things that kind of go hand in hand. We wanted to change and adapt it because our view was, well, if we're talking to people with epilepsy, living with epilepsy, they know what their life is. They know the challenges. So ultimately, we're not doing it. We're not moving anything by talking to them. It's not to say that we're not talking to them, but in a sense, where we wanted to reposition this piece of activity was actually on people who don't have epilepsy, who don't have experience of it and are disconnected from it. Not because they don't care or they aren't interested, but just because it hasn't come up in their lives. And so what we did was we looked at, from a news perspective, we looked at the really rough end of what happens to people when they experience a seizure in public. So what's the reaction from people? And we were able to really quickly underpin that actually lots of people treat them as if they are drunk or on drugs. They do things like a good proportion of them when it happens, and it happens more than we would expect. A lot of people are robbed, experience sexual assault. The worst parts of humanity experience themselves when people are vulnerable. And really quickly, we were then able to make people like me, who are kind of living obliviously, ignorance is bliss, living obliviously as to what the challenges are. And actually, then we're able to make people watch and listen and pay attention and say, all you need to do when something like this happens is learn this. We had an acronym about what to do. All you need to do is learn this acronym, so that actually when it happens, it could happen on the train that you're about to get on. It could happen on the way home, anything. It could happen in the office. All you need to do is these 4 things. And actually, that was really effective. It was really effective at making people go, do you know what? I can do something about this, even if that something is just learning. And that is a perfect example. People are inherently, I believe that people are inherently good. People want to do things for the betterment of all of us, but we have to bring them in. And if it feels too disconnected, if it feels like you're looking up at, somebody getting an Oscar and it's just that moment and they're saying, do this, it's very easy to see how there's no real connection there. Versus, what can you do and how can you be part of this? We're social creatures. How can you be part of this and connect up? And that, I think, is one of the missing links. Like that bit of bringing everyone into it in a way that they understand, doesn't feel judgmental. All of those things, I think, is what is missing.
Yeah, I think realistically, 99.9% of the population are good people and they do want to help out. I think I've traveled around enough to realize that people, even in the poorest of areas, like I can come in as a white man to a place that's very, they don't really have much, and that's still more helpful than a lot of other people. And it's very much, everybody wants to help somebody. Nobody wants to see somebody struggle. And I think if somebody can help in the smallest way they can, they will do. And I think that is 99.9% of the population. Obviously, you're going to have like the few outliers there. They'll be like, absolutely not. But like, you can go into, for instance, the States. We look at the States kind of like this kind of corrupt bunch of crazy people with like extreme opinions. But that's realistically not most of them.
Yeah.
Like, they're the ones that kind of get put on to the media as the extremes. And I think when you, even with those people with those extreme opinions, I don't think the majority don't care about things. They all care about their own issues. But when it comes down to a fundamental of, just humans, like if somebody was in need, they'd probably help them. And I think that's realistically it. And I think people do get portrayed as, people with like, no sympathy, no compassion towards people, whereas realistically, the majority of us do. There's going to be the few psychotic people that don't. But like, I think I use Americans as examples because yes, they're in a country where it's very corrupted and we're only getting shown the worst of the worst. And you're like, oh well, these people voted for this, so they must be insane. But that's not that. That's just how marketing and media works to obviously sway in the best or the worst of ways.
It's giving you an image, isn't it? It's giving you an image of the extreme. And actually, news in its entirety is very often extreme. You have a certain amount of time to demonstrate the stories of that day. And those stories, what is going to be going through producers' minds is, how do we best represent Life is chaos. The world is chaos. People are chaos. And actually, you're having to kind of best. I don't envy them. You're having to best represent everything that's happening in that 24-hour period, and also try to explain what might be the repercussions, what might come out of something like this. I think it's a very difficult area to balance, but you're absolutely right. You see the extreme. And again, if we think about climate, you see the extreme of, these shock moments happening. But if you track into, the example that you gave about America, and we think about, the political landscape at the moment and what people will think about, the people that have voted in a certain way, or the other way. But actually, that is built on decades of us understanding who and what America is. So the part of the issue is that it kind of goes at odds with what we'd expect of America. And it could be any other nation, right? Russia is another example. It doesn't kind of matter who it is. The thing that we've built up in our minds of the perception, when that is hit, it shocks. But what I feel like I keep going back and banging on about entertainment. If you think about America, their biggest export, I believe, is not necessarily monetarily, but their biggest export is culture. We all, pretty much everywhere around the world, subscribe to, and I don't want to say kind of live our lives towards, but we follow that, in a way that the American culture of what they send out with TV and entertainment and content, if you think about just purely Friends in its own entirety, how many countries Friends is still being shown on, which is it's ostensibly quite a boring TV show, but we eat it up because ultimately it's comfort. And actually, if they're setting the agenda of what we find entertaining, then they're setting the agenda of what we find to be the norm. And so actually, it's soft power at its absolute greatest. And so when you think about Ross and Rachel, you don't necessarily think about January 6th. And that's where I think things are so shocking. And so the news has to, replicate, because the perception perhaps is Ross and Rachel. That's America. New York City, I love NYC, etc. And then this is what we're seeing. So it's almost like these extremes that we see, and that's news. And I think what we have to really rely on, as you say, is that it is an extreme. It is one factor, and we have to really ensure that we're not always just taking the extreme. And I think that if we roll it back into climate, we're not always taking the extreme. There are things that we should be talking about, and we should be doing more to shine a light on. Yes, it's a crisis, but actually, what amazing things are happening. Blue Planet, as a perfect example, a few years back, when people saw that episode, it hit people, and that is the kind of stuff that we need more and more. We need to be seeing it, and we need to understand it in a way that is simple. You can't just keep rolling David Attenborough out. So it's not just on him. I think as much as he's useful, it's on kind of all of us to be looking at it in the same way that, we've tackled things. So maybe we need, I think Gale's left Coronation Street now, but we need like the David Attenborough equivalent in Corrie just to step forward, whoever that might be. But, I'm joking, but ultimately that's where it's crossed over. That's where it's hitting us. So we need the news to give us the scary and the reality and the extreme to kind of shock us. And then we need someone to come around and give us the arm around the shoulder and say, do you know what? If we do this, this and this, and we work really hard and we all come together as a species, and I realize I'm painting a rainbow-led image here. But if we do that, then actually we're in a much better position at tackling these issues, regardless of whatever that issue is.
Why do you think it is that the UK struggles to sustain coverage around climate change? Like without a climate catastrophe happening, like
Yeah.
it should be, because it's such a huge issue that's affecting everybody that we should kind of be on top of it on a day-to-day basis, even if it's the smallest like talk about it. But they're just, unless something bad happens, something catastrophic happens, then it's not covered.
I think it's threefold. I think the first one, and this, well, I'm going to go backwards. I think the third most important factor is eco-anxiety, right? It's scary. And I think more than it just being scary, the factor is actually, it's like, if we tackle this subject, what's the, not backlash, but what's the, are we going to tackle it in the right way? Am I an expert in this area? We have journalists writing on all different things, general news reporters writing on all different things. But actually, you probably need a bit of a degree to be able to confidently do this, right? And there's always that balance of, two sides within a debate, a quote unquote debate. And how do you get that right? And actually, when you start to think about that, you kind of go, I'll look at something else. And that I think is a big part of it. The second part of it I think is linked is that there is so much. There is so much in terms of, I think the term is omnicrisis. We're constantly facing something. We're constantly in the battle of something. It's been a while since we've had the news agenda led by something fun and upbeat. Well, let's all get back to the days of, what's it called? Boaty McBoatface. Great, amazing, right? And that's just so perfect of us. And I don't think there's malice in there. It's just what we are. That's who we are as people. And I think the final factor is ultimately it's got to come from all different corners. The final factor is that we aren't living it, right? It's not on our doorstep. If you think about COVID, there were a couple of key markers in the kind of the news. There were lots of key markers in the news story of COVID, but the two that I would give as kind of parallel are, if you remember when, I think you might have been in Indonesia at the time, but here, when COVID was making its way across Europe, we were being shown horrendous images of Italy, right? Hospitals in Italy.
Yeah.
And we were going, oh, those poor people. Oh. And there were people still saying like, it's not going to come here. And we soon learned that wasn't the case. Right? But we were in this mindset that, there's a safety. There were people talking about, we're an island. It's, it's X, Y, and Z. And actually that is probably where we're sort of at, right? We're looking and saying those poor people going through those experiences. And then you've also got people, in the climate discussion, you've also got people talking about, well, actually it's the way that the earth works, and, it's a correction of things, and, et cetera, et cetera. In the COVID discussion, you had people of, well, X, Y, and Z, this is the way that things are. I'm not an expert in either. But the reality is the narrative is quite similar. And then it hit. And then suddenly we were really, it's not that we weren't interested, of course we were, but we were really interested in how it was impacting us day to day. The difference is we haven't got the direct impacts of day to day that we can see, feel, smell, touch, cry about. All of those things, we haven't got that yet. So I think when it comes to that, I would point towards the things that you can't see, smell, feel, all of those things in those similar examples. Mental health. It's hard for people to see it, right? It's hard for people, unless you've got direct experience of it, either yourself or someone that you love. It's hard to get your head around. It's tough, but it's been done, right? And it's been done through talking about these key issues. then we've had more people opening up about their experiences. And I think as time goes on and we start to see more of the implications hitting, we'll get there. People will wake up to it. But it would be great if we got there before and we could do more about it. That, I think, is the thing. At the moment, it's in this lofty phase, in a sense. And I use the word lofty, it sounds flippant, but it's in a lofty phase because I think a lot of people think of it as, well, I can't do anything because, XYZ country isn't doing anything. So what can I do? I put my bottles in the right bin, and that's as far as it goes. But if we can start to reach those people and highlight why putting those bottles in that right bin matters, why doing X, Y, and Z matters, why making this choice as opposed to this choice matters, in a way that is reaching them. We talked about Corrie, EastEnders, all of these things, the examples filtering right through. It could be influencers, it could be reality TV, it could be any of this mix. But ultimately, it's getting that bit as opposed to where we're currently at, which is, very often you'll hear about, us definitely not going to meet an objective, or the term net zero. And I think people are just feeling disconnected to it. And that's perhaps replicated in this report.
I think you're right when it does come to wording, because I think as well, if you're waking up and being told that the world is running out and there's only a few decades left, and for someone that is young, how is that going to affect them? And like, some people be like, hey, what's the point of me trying? There's a shit show out there. Like, why am I going to get out of bed when to help fuel mass destruction? I think there has to be wording around it that is helpful, but also push the narrative without scaring somebody so much that they're like, well, what's the point? Like,
Yeah.
there's no point me leaving the house because now I have, severe anxiety around this whole entire issue. How is what I'm eating? How is what I'm doing? How is what I'm driving? How is me going on holiday? How is this, fill in blank for whatever, gonna then affect the world? And yeah, I think it's very much trying to find the wording, because I don't think the terms that come through sometimes can be productive in conversation.
No.
It just causes disparity and separation, and it can divide people. It doesn't really bring people together.
We found that crisis is everywhere within this, and I think to an extent, the fact that there is so much use of crisis that actually it's lost to an extent a bit of its power. If everything's a crisis, then it's just the norm, isn't it? And so if you become used to the norm, then you have to go somewhere else. But I think that we have a bit of an opportunity. I'm so funny. I'm normally a glass half empty person, but we have an opportunity to actually do something and do something different. Like, I think we have a responsibility to try and build out elements of hope. What is it that people can genuinely do with this information? The stuff that we do on, day-to-day activity and campaigns is about, we talk about things like call to action. What is it that person can do? And it might be, call to action is just understanding something, knowing something, learning about something. It might be that, we're asking people to step up and speak to their local MP, apply for a job, or, whatever it is, but something that gives that person a connection to that story. I can do something, as opposed to I'm lost in this environment. And I think that PR has a real opportunity. News isn't there to give you answers. News is to give you information. And so to an extent, that kind of underpins why it seems so scary, because there is the missing bit of hope. And often we'll go to experts who perhaps aren't always best placed to give you hope, because they're telling you what is happening in that crisis moment. Realistically, what's happening in between? I think I said it's like a roller coaster. It goes up and down in terms of the discussion. But actually, what happens in between? And who is out there saying, well, look, this has been horrendous. This has been awful. this is what we might be able to do. This, if we were to do X, Y, and Z, if we were to understand collectively that if we were to make this choice as opposed to this, that's going to start kind of impacting. And then if we were to see that in Love Island, right? If you start to see it, it starts to become more of a reality. And I think that's something that could have a real impact and change the way that, you and I will be talking about this in 10 years' time. But if we don't, I think we'll just be in the same kind of boat, looking at the next crisis, looking at the next thing. And actually we're seeing other issues, formulate, and we're tackling them in lots of different ways with great success.
We see, although we're ripping into broadcasting networks for not publicizing it enough, I think guessing by your reporting as well, there's probably more broadcasters that are doing more than others. Like, there's definitely going to be ones that are reporting more than there are others, and for whatever reason. And I guess that probably depends on what it is, whether that's TV versus radio versus local versus national.
Yeah.
And each one of those is going to have such a different narrative depending on the location. And is there ones that are realistically doing more for the climate crisis than others?
It's a tricky one, because when we say doing more, it's a different one, because in a way, part of that suggests that there's advocacy going on in there, and I think that's a tricky area. So I wouldn't say that certain stations or outlets are doing more. I think there is a genuine nervousness around this subject, hesitancy around going into one specific area, and I think that is key. I think what we see from the report, there are outlets that it makes natural sense. So, for instance, BBC World, I think, is the most engaged, and it makes sense because actually people who are listening to BBC World Service are possibly living that experience, and it makes sense why that would be there. I think ones that I would point to as really effective is Radio 4. I think Radio 4 does this so well, and certainly within this does this so well that they're able to dedicate time and attention to these moments. And if you think about it, the wildfires is a perfect, or the Spanish floods is a perfect example of where Radio 4 can do this well. Now, they have to cover that news, horrendous news, but they can't use a visual. So it's discussion. And there is research that points to how we connect with our local presenters, our radio presenters, more so than we do with influencers and other kind of factors. And the reason for that is they're there, right? We get to know them. We get to know their voices. That when it comes to local, we know, we can kind of imagine them in the shops that we're shopping at, living the life that we're living. So suddenly you know these people. It's probably scarier for them when they're actually out in the shops and people are like, I recognize you. But they're able to do it, and they're able to reach us because they've got the time, they've got the ability to dig into this subject in possibly quite a soothing way. Radio is the best place, I think, for difficult subjects to exist, because there's time, there's space to really explore stuff. There are opportunities to bring people in who have lived this thing. And actually, when you're listening to somebody describing, chaos and what they've done, very often these are people who have, had to rebuild. There's something heartening about that. And suddenly it doesn't feel so abstract. So I think, to answer your question, there are stations and outlets that are doing more, covering it more from a natural perspective. I would point to places like Radio 4 as doing it really well. But I think on the whole, it lands more than not in news and bulletins. And that is difficult because actually bulletins, are just a snapshot, when really what we're seeing is that we need more in terms of those people that you trust and engage with and connect to. We need more of that. If you think about the challenges that people are facing right now, you've got the issues going on in Birmingham and refuse collection. Now, those stations, places like BBC WM, are going to be vital in terms of people being able to get through that crisis, right? And you could make links to what's going on in the world of climate, to what is going on in their current climate. I'm based in Manchester, so I'm not in Birmingham. You could make links to that. And actually, those presenters will be out there holding people to account, talking about people's experiences. And it's a good marker. It's probably one that, for people listening, to try and go back and listen to what happens in Birmingham and see how they did it, and then try and replicate that across climate action, because it's those moments that we can really reach people genuinely. I think that's the goal.
I think as well with local radios, local broadcast medias, people I think are more in tune to it because they feel like these presenters know them, because
Absolutely.
it's very much you're surrounded by them. And I think also the bigger news networks, I don't know whether that's because they don't want to feel that they're misinforming or over-informing at the same time, because you're going to get people from all angles feeling like they're being presented with a lot of information but don't know how to use that. So are they then more misinformed? And I think especially when we have, especially in the last, I'd say 10 years of legacy media and mainly newspapers and clickbait 24/7.
Yeah.
That it's nothing's really to be trusted, and it's not to be successful a lot of the time. And I see I've seen this with podcasts, outrageous titles for more clicks, for more listens. You see it with YouTube, you see it with newspapers, news articles, whatever. But when it comes to news broadcasting networks on TV and radio, it's a bit harder to do that. So
there's genuine regulation.
Yeah.
There's genuine regulation. The difficulty is it's not perfect. It is not perfect in any way. Pretty much networks of all stripes have made big mistakes. And has the public always forgiven them? Don't know. I don't know. No media is completely innocent. And the bit is, well, how do you get across, and how do you reach people in that instance? How do you cut through things like clickbait? Because ultimately it works. It works. It catches your attention. And I think where we've ended up is, the report kind of points towards that emotionally charged language. I think that's the version of clickbait. The difficulty is, as you say, things haven't necessarily become less trustworthy. We've lost faith. And that has to be worked on. But doing that in a world where media is changing, doing that in a world where, everything is about clicks and eyeballs, is really hard. It's very hard for media outlets to be able to do that, to and retain a position or grow a position. So it's coming at a time where it's coming at the worst possible time, really bluntly. But again, it's only impossible until it's been done. And that, I think, is the bit that gives me a bit of hope. And, we talked a bit about the local presenters. When you see, I think a lot of kind of people in the media space will often think about local radio, as not stacking up to national radio, right? Which I couldn't disagree with more. Some of the best journalistic talent that we've got exists in local radio. And I say that as somebody that deals with both national and regional radio. Some of the people that are able to hold power to account are best placed in local radio, because actually, as you say, they live the experiences. They know what's happening on your high street, right? They walk past it. It's not It's not a distant, far-flung thing, and you feel connected to them. So if something is happening, to me, they are one of the best people to challenge on that, genuinely. And they have the most amazing skills of, very often lulling people into a false sense of security that you're talking to a local station and you're not about to get a grilling, and then bang, you're getting a grilling, which is, I love. I think that's fantastic. So I think trust in media is something that really needs to be worked on, but it comes at a time when the ability to change tack, change approach is so difficult.
I think as they evolve, obviously they then have to evolve how they really pursue what they're saying and the information they're giving, because if they don't, what's the real world impact in 5 years down the line, like beyond just media metrics? Like if they don't pursue a narrative that informs people and helps people, and more misinformation, or people feel disinformed and have their own opinions and things like that, what does that realistically look like down the line if they don't pursue a different path and trying to help? And I know there is going to be regulations around that, and you're always going to have, as better for worse, there's always going to be lobbyists around things as well with some certain channels, which is unfortunate, but that's also how they get funding to actually keep presenting.
Yeah.
And yeah, we kind of live in a
but
time
we also need rules and regulation on things like that. That shouldn't be a free fall. It's not. But I know that organizations, so in our sector, the PRCA, so like the industry body for this, is working on those rules when it comes to things like lobbying. That's important too. None of this, I think regulation within media is really important. The difficulty we've almost got to an extent as well is that you have regulation on some media and then no regulation on other media, which makes it difficult, because again, if trust is low and you're looking at one source and it's giving you the insider view, and then you're looking at a source that you're told, this is who you've trusted from when you've grown up. This is, they've broadcast to you from, if you've watched CBBC as a kid and then you've grown up and you trust the BBC, and actually there's a different bit of information here, usually because something is, hidden. That's the worst word I could have used, but usually it's something that's challenged by various different laws that you can't necessarily publish certain information, but it's ablaze on social media. And so it immediately looks like that trusted source of information is trying to hide information from you. It's trying to keep things back, either for personal gain or things like that. But it's almost because there's a broad lack of media understanding now. It used to be a joke when I was a kid. It used to be a joke about things like media studies degrees. Yeah, and now I think you need a media studies degree just to be able to get through. And I'm not kidding. Media literacy in the world of fake news and misinformation, it's vital to society. We've seen it happen in lots of different guises. But to be able to navigate what sources of information and how to actually interrogate things, it's a core skill, and I'm not sure we're there yet. And that's scary.
Yeah, I think especially on what we spoke about before we came on is the fact that we need regulations around certain aspects. And I say this with running a podcast as well, that there does need to be regulations, because there is so much misinformation out there where people are trusting podcasters, for instance, or people without degrees in things. There's then information spread that isn't overly accurate as well. And whether or not you're getting accurate information from a broadcast network or a podcaster or any other type of media, is the fact that we do need regulation, or at least the guests that are coming on need vetting. Because that way because there's always going to be nuances within everything. So whether that be, having a conversation about like climate change or nutrition or whatever, everybody's going to have slightly different opinions, but obviously, unless they're vetted, unless they have some sort of education around it, then they shouldn't be on talking about it. And I think that's one of the big issues, and we see that especially in the podcast world, we're seeing that with various different. I don't think I need to name names without people knowing who the podcasts are. But there's some very very high profile ones, and like yes, I think they also had high intentions or good intentions when they first started their podcasts. Whether or not that's kind of gone out the window with the being able to have clickbait or conversations that are a bit kind of parallel to what the science is saying, or unparalleled to what the science is saying.
I think it's worth. I agree. I think that the podcast world needs regulation. I think it should hopefully come from self-regulation before it reaches places like Ofcom, etc. But I think that it needs it because there has to be something. There has to be something that allows us to protect people, because there are going to be instances. Health is a perfect example. You put into Google, some symptoms that you're experiencing, and it's almost a joke that how quickly you can diagnose yourself with cancer, and that's scary. It on the flip side, that could also be the moment that somebody goes, I need to go and get this checked, and it turns out to be cancer. So it's hard because you're balancing the bad and the good, right? And I flip flop around on a personal and professional view of things like social media, which is the example, right? And another example: do you need to identify yourself to join a social network? Now, on the one hand, that is going to potentially solve big challenges. If need be, we can identify who that person is and they can be held to account for their actions. That can be really, really powerful and actually solve an awful lot of things that we're facing as a society. On the flip side, I also worked the beginning of my career on placing experts around the Arab Spring. And a lot of that was driven by social media accounts that were anonymous. And actually, if you look at laws and things, if you start to put in ID and things like that, actually, it's quite easy to see how using social media for good, when it comes to, say, revolution and power, actually can be used for bad. And so it's so intrinsic to our lives that I think we have to really take each step really carefully, but with a view of doing good in the long run. It's a nigh on impossible task in every which way possible. And so when we, drawing it into this and what we can do, I think it does come from proactive engagement, proactive building of stories. Your listeners are in this world and will be sitting on stories and things that they're doing. And my first piece of advice or plea almost is to encourage your listeners to kind of sit there and write out like 1 to 10 what amazing things have you done, and actually can you get that to your local media, get them talking about it, because actually they want to, and you've got the assets and the abilities. Go and tell your stories, even if you think it's small fry. Doesn't matter, go for it, because actually that could spark a change, and it could spark that presenter to go, oh, I need to do this. And I give an example of we did some work in the world of male breast cancer, and we did a campaign looking at how prevalent it is in the UK. Again, it's one of those things that it's more than we would perhaps expect, and then we dug into the stigma, the nature of it, and all of that. One of the things that we found looking at it and evaluating it after was that we had presenters. So we did it in the second week of Breast Cancer Awareness Month to we effectively worked with the kind of the female breast cancer charities to say, right, if you're going here, we're not going to try and gazump anything that you're doing because that's really important. There's many more people affected. We're going to go in the second week and do this. What we were able to see is that between October and I think we stopped tracking it in the March the following year, when people talked about breast cancer on broadcast, we saw a significant rise in people saying, and remember, it's not just women that can get this, men can also get this too. Now, that's not taking away from the core issue, but it is showing that the presenters are kind of willing and they are engaged in a subject. And when you've reached them, they will keep talking about it. And I think that's the bit. So if I can, my call to action of this is please do, if you're in this world, think about what things have you done in the last 6 months, year, however small, and get that out there to media, because I think they will cover it. They just need something proactive away from the shock and horror.
It is very much, putting the boring but essential bits to media. What you may think is something boring and small that you may know may be of benefit to other people, like whether that be like policy or whether that be infrastructure. It seems boring, but those things are essential, especially when it comes to things like climate change. And it actually, those things can engage with everyday viewers, but everybody has different interests and everybody has different things that they can put their mind to. And one thing's not going to be a cookie cutter approach to every single person. So if you have something, let's say it was policy, that's going to really be a thing for somebody. And so infrastructure may be a thing for someone else. And, there's always different ways, but unless those get pushed forward, people won't know they exist.
Exactly. And somebody doing something where you are, right? In Essex, if you listen to that on BBC Essex, a local story, someone's doing something amazing, fantastic, right? That has got the hallmarks of the types of things that media will cover. And you know what? It probably doesn't have the word crisis written in. It probably doesn't have the words ticking time bomb, but it shows lots of things. It shows that people care, and it shows that it's okay to care. And it tells audiences in that area, do you know what? It doesn't always have to be this big extreme thing that you see on TV. Actually, there are people near to you that are doing something. There are people that do care about this issue. And this could apply to climate, to any other issue. The more you proactively engage and you've got the positive in there, in this feature-led type news, the better for all of us. Genuinely, the better for all of us.
Yeah, you don't need to kind of join, for instance, just a poll to actually make a change. Like you can do things independently and on a small scale that may potentially have a bigger impact down the line.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think people don't realize that, but over time, those small changes do have significant impacts, and we see that throughout various different ventures. Like everything does have a global impact down the line.
It's like saying it takes a village to raise a child. If the child is the subject of climate change, it takes all of us to get out there. And for the most part, the news is doing its job.
Mm-hmm.
But I would argue if we were to look at the scary side, the hardcore news element of the subject of mental health, it's going to be a certain proportion. And actually, if we to then look at the amount of brands that are doing amazing things, ordinary people that are just doing amazing things to help each other, actually that's going to make a big part of extra stuff. I've seen things about buses that have been kind of recommandeered to help connect up disparate communities. There was something the other day on my feed about barbers being trained in like mental health services to talk to men who obviously notoriously don't talk about their feelings and things like that. This is doable. This is doable, right? Look, I think there's a lot of crossover here that we could learn from that journey. hate the word journeying comms. I can't believe I've just used it. But that pathway, well, it's even worse. But there are a lot of things that we can learn from that and apply to climate, genuinely.
I couldn't agree more. Before I round this up, because it's been such a interesting and relevant conversation to especially the world we're in now, whether no matter what part of the world you're in, this is affecting everybody in every country, in every small town, or if it's not affecting you personally now, that it could in the future. And I think for anybody that wants to know more about the the climate crisis or the work you're doing, where can people find you?
So you can head over to our website, bbroadcast.co.uk, and then we are on Instagram and Blue Sky and LinkedIn. It should just be, if you put in bbroadcast or bbroadcast PR, will come up. But the report that is there it's free to download. We tried to make it so it's got almost actionable tips that people can use. That's just on the website. It's just there. And I genuinely, my hope is that people can take it and do something with it. Look at it and flip it into a positive, right? There's some challenges there. How can we change that? And I think the first thing people can do is just think about what cool things are they doing that actually other people down the road would be interested in. Genuinely, I think that's the first thing.
I will link that in the show notes because I have downloaded it, I have read it, and it's absolutely incredible and very visual as well. It's not kind of just like statistics and bullet points and things like that. It's visually pleasing to anybody from any understanding, to kind of get to grips with what's happening, how it happens, and everything along the lines of that.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's a bit of a labour of love where we build data into everything that we do. And I think sometimes it's good to look at that stuff. We did exactly the same thing. I'm encouraging listeners to think about their stories. It's a similar thing. We're looking at it and actually what can we do to inflect a bit of good change? Well, we aren't experts. We aren't, if somebody were to put me on the spot and ask me about climate policy, I would crumble. I wouldn't know. But ultimately, I know that people who are kind of listening to you are, right? Or are incredibly passionate about this. And those are the people that we need to be hearing from. Those are the ones that we need to be hearing from about what can be done. And hopefully this report is a bit of a starter for 10.
It definitely is. Josh, thank you so much for being here. It's been a pleasure. I'm grateful for you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's been fun to sit and kind of hash it all out. It's been really good and kind of take to task the media at the same time.